Thank you very much. On behalf of UN Women and the co-organizers of this session, the United Nations Development Programme and the World Bank, we welcome you warmly, our distinguished guests, to this session on addressing the recovery needs of women, girls, people with disabilities, and other marginalized groups. My name is Rahel Steinbach, and I'm leading UN Women's global disaster risk reduction and resilience work. I have the honor to serve as moderator for this session, which is bringing together a panel of highly distinguished gender, disability, resilience, and recovery champions from across the globe. We have 3 panelists here and then 2 additional panelists online. Please allow me to start with a few housekeeping issues before we dive into the thematic parts of the session. Firstly, we warmly welcome our remote participants who have joined us from across the globe. And we would like to confirm that during the questions and answers session, only in-person participants here in Bali will be able to share their reflections and ask questions and answers. That is a technical restriction, unfortunately, of this session. And secondly, we would like to confirm that there are sign language and real-time captioning in the plenary sessions, of course, but for this session, we have translation services in Spanish, English, French, and Bahasa. On behalf of UN Women, I would like to now share our opening reflections. Over the past 2 years, disasters, climate, and environmental crisis, coupled with the COVID-19 pandemic, have turned into widespread and interlinked crises, which have distinct and disproportionate effects of women and girls, people with disabilities, and other high-risk and marginalized groups. We have seen, to no surprise, that the overwhelming majority of additional unpaid care work caused by the climate and disaster crisis, including the COVID-19 crisis, has fallen on women due to gender-specific norms and expectations. We have also witnessed strong spikes of gender-based violence in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as other disasters, where women and girls are the overwhelming majority of victims and survivors. This, coupled with numerous other barriers experienced by the most marginalized in times of disasters, climate change, and crisis, strongly undermines their resilience and ability to recover. The unfortunate truth is that despite progress, significant gender disability and social inclusion gaps remain in recovery governance, processes, and outcomes. These gaps reinforce existing inequalities, risks, and impacts following a disaster or a crisis. And they make it harder and sometimes simply impossible for the most marginalized to recover. To accelerate progress in this area, we need to move beyond the vulnerability discourse and situate women in all their diversity, people with disabilities, youth, and other high-risk and marginalized groups as key actors, agents of change, and leaders in recovery, decision-making processes, coordination mechanisms, and all activities. And in today's session, this is what we will be discussing. We also need to learn from the COVID-19 pandemic and reflect on what needs to change to enable diverse leadership and participation in recovery, and to adequately address the needs of women and girls, people with disabilities, and other high-risk and marginalized groups. At UN Women, we support women's empowerment and leadership in recovery governance. This includes securing the involvement of national gender machineries and women's organizations in recovery mechanisms. We work with a network of about 500 women's organizations annually to do so. We also advocate for gender-responsive and inclusive recovery processes, which mainstream gender data and analysis across recovery assessments, such as post-disaster needs assessments. Similarly, we support the meaningful participation of women, including young women and women with disabilities, in decision-making, focusing also on advocating for the mobilization of financial and technical resources to support women in these critical roles. And we recognize the need to accelerate progress by contributing to gender-responsive normative frameworks and their implementation. This includes building on the important gains made during the recent Commission on the Status of Women 66, which focused on the priority theme, achieving gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls in the context of climate change, environmental and disaster risk reduction policies and programs. Importantly, we need to leverage opportunities presented through the ongoing midterm review of the Sendai framework. Finally, UN Women works to ensure that the post-disaster needs and priorities of women and girls and people with disabilities are a cross-cutting consideration in all sectors. We are therefore co-organizing this session at the World Reconstruction Conference with this important focus in mind. Let me now turn to our distinguished panelists who will share their diverse experiences and highlight key challenges, opportunities, and good practices for building resilience through gender-responsive and inclusive recovery in a COVID-19 transformed world. Our first speaker is Dr. Inamur Rahman, the Honorable State Minister of the Ministry of Disaster Management and Relief in Bangladesh. Your Excellency, Dr. Inam, you are a Bangladeshi physician, businessman, politician, and the incumbent State Minister and Member of Parliament representing the Dhaka 19 constituency. You are also the current State Minister of the Ministry of Disaster Management and Relief since January 2019. You are the founder chairman of Inam Medical College Hospital, which is the largest private medical college hospital in the country and which provides free health service for underprivileged people in Bangladesh. You have dedicated your life for disaster-resilient and developed Bangladesh. Dr. Inam, we are honored that you are part of our panel today, and we thank you for your time. Dr. Inam, I will ask you our question. Your government has many successful lessons to share on gender-responsive recovery. Could you please kindly tell us about the experience of the government of Bangladesh, and in particularly the Ministry of Disaster Management and Relief, in ensuring women's inclusion in recovery and development processes? Dr. Inam, you have the floor. Thank you.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Respected Chair, Moderator, Speakers, distinguished guests and participants, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum and very good evening. It is my great pleasure to be here in the auspicious events in GPDRR, and let me congratulate the organizer of World Reconstruction Conference, the World Bank, UNDRR, GFDRR, to facilitate the important issues to unlock the potential of gender disability inclusive recovery. Distinguished participants, guests, Bangladesh is highly susceptible to natural and human-induced disasters due to her geophysical location, climate vulnerability, land characteristics, and persistence of other hazards. Over the last 1 decade, the country has developed disaster risk reduction and mitigation mechanism to address the adversities that her people experience frequently. Although disaster affects all segments of population, vulnerability to disaster is related to physical, economic, and social factors. Vulnerability is closely linked with people's age, gender, disabilities, and other identities. The study reveals that women in Bangladesh face greater challenges compared to men during a disaster. Pioneering researcher on gender and disaster in Bangladesh argues that despite challenges, women have proven an incredible potential to respond to disasters effectively, which often go largely unrecognized. Ministry of Disaster Management and Relief, Government of the People's Republic of Bangladesh, under the dynamic leadership of our Honorable Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina, has taken significant initiatives to build gender, disability inclusive, resilient strategies in the disaster risk reduction process using inclusiveness. I would like to share you that cyclone-related disaster mortality has fallen from 7-digit to single-digit compared to it in 1970 called Bhola cyclone. As I mentioned here, the disaster affects differently to women, children, persons with disabilities and other marginal groups due to their vulnerability. But we can say our milestone achievement that in 1970 cyclone, 90% of the deceased were women and children. The ratio between women, children and men was 14:1. However, now it reduced to 1:1 in recent cases. This reveals how gender gaps have been minimized in disaster risk management. Effective and useful warning dissemination by the community volunteers is one of the salient aspects for better preparedness is the key to reduce the loss and damage. Recent study report of Bangladesh Institute of Development Studies, BIDS, revealed that 70% risk can be reduced through the better preparedness. It is argued that preparedness for a new kind of disaster is difficult for any system or structure, as it is related to the experiences based on earlier disaster. It is expected that people's coping mechanism will help in building resilience for future disaster like pandemic. Bangladesh has given timely focus on pandemic-related risk management approach, pandemic livelihoods, linkage and understanding gender-based resilience to reduce vulnerability during and post-pandemic situation and resilient recovery as well. However, in a gendered economics and culture, as of other disaster, the outcome of pandemic falls disproportionate on women and men. Ladies and gentlemen, we recall once again that Bangladesh named as role model of disaster management despite one of the most disaster prone and climate vulnerable country. The success lies with long experience and evaluation of disaster risk management through a paradigm shift we called as proactive disaster risk management instead of reactive one. This contributes remarkably to reduce the loss and damage that lessen the dependence on post-disaster response and resources. We have been practicing whole of society and government approach that includes all institutions from national to local level. We consider the whole of cycle in disaster risk management, while risk reduction and recovery receive priority to reduce the post-disaster relief and humanitarian support. I find recovery through Build Back Better principle keeps the lowering of investment for DRR also, while the underlying messages of Sendai framework stated that invest of $1 during preparedness and pre-disaster recovery can save $6 for post-disaster response. I strongly support the message, and now we are shifting our strategy thus way to enhance our resilience efforts. You all know Bangladesh is also the pioneer to promote disability and gender inclusive disaster risk management with a special focus on recovery and response preparedness. Our Honorable Prime Minister inspired us and guide us to follow the key messages of SDG, leaving no one behind. Our damage and loss assessment form called DFORM is such an instrument that facilitated to collect gender, age, disability disaggregated data to use in recovery and development planning process. The data has been used for pre and post-disaster recovery through inclusion of gender and other issues of marginalization. Respected moderator and participants, I would like to mention that sectoral data for recovery are being used for national level recovery planning, which are being validated by the Interministerial Disaster Management Coordination Committee. We have given emphasis to increase investment for both of structural and non-structural investment for resilience that contributes to sustainable development. We are addressing both recurring and mega disaster, including earthquake, through risk identification, reduction, response, and recovery for building resilience. Ladies and gentlemen, gender inclusive pandemic study is the demand of time, as reinforced gender roles often make gender division of labor critical, where violation of one party, especially women, more vulnerable and victim to domestic violation, economic stress, political crisis. According to Government of Bangladesh, National Preparedness and Response Plan for COVID-19, humanitarian response, prevention of catastrophic health expenditure, stimulus packages for small enterprises, and recovery are emphasized with the principle of no one left behind with social and gender inclusion. Country has given a specific emphasis on gender and social inclusion, participation and leadership of women in DRR and resilience building, adopting a whole of society approach. In the ASF-DRR, realities of intersectoral categories, example, elderly, ethnic, minorities, persons with disability, people living under difficult circumstances, and other marginalized categories were addressed with special attention to enhance resilience. The major drivers on DRR in Bangladesh include number of regulatory framework and guidelines. National Plan for Disaster Management, the 5-year plan started from 2021, and now we have updated the NPDM for 2021-2025. The plan is very aligned with Sendai framework, SDGs, and climate actions. The pandemic aspects incorporated in recovery, response, and preparedness phases for resilience. Standing order on disaster, SOD, is our most important disaster risk management framework, which is prepared in 1997, then revised in 2010, and again revised in 2019, consistent with the changing nature of risk and global development in disaster risk management system. We have updated SOD that incorporated the key themes and message of Sendai framework, SDG, in reducing the loss and damage. Ladies and gentlemen, the Ministry of Disaster Management has taken initiatives following our father of nation, Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman's thoughts, and emphasizing on both structural and non-structural DRR recovery activities, such as reviving and reconstructing Mujib Killa, known as Arden Fort, in different disasters affected regions, increasing number of cyclone and flood shelters, improving roads and communication networks, and constructing disaster resilience houses for the vulnerable people. The shelters are accessible and inclusive for persons with disability, women, children, and elderly persons. Multi-purpose accessible boats are contributing disability, gender inclusive, and quick evacuation for saving lives and protection of assets at risk community. Being identified as role model for disaster management in the Mujib centenary, the National Adaptation Center, Dhaka, offer has been established in 2020. Bangladesh is also recognized as pioneer in promoting gender and DRR agenda within South Asia and has received global recognition for gender mainstreaming efforts. Respected moderators and participants, Bangladesh has given emphasis on risk-informed and gender-inclusive development for its LDC graduation process. The pre-disaster rectory planning plays a key role for women inclusion. The inclusive, effective recovery efforts can sustain and protect the development gain. DRR, including better recovery, directly contributes to the SDGs, while vulnerability reduction, which is one of the key determinant, contributes for LDC graduation for Bangladesh. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to mention that we achieved United Nations Public Service Award 2021 for the initiative of women empowerment in Cyclone Preparedness Program in the category of promoting gender-responsive public service to achieve SDGs. While Cyclone Preparedness Program, known as Global Best Practice for Disaster Risk Management, including inclusive recovery, is instrumental to achieve this landmark. I would like to thank moderator, organizer, and for organizing this event under World Reconstruction Conference initiatives. I also thank to the government of Indonesia and UNDRR to organize jointly the GPDRR 2022 here in Bali. I find the session share global and regional knowledge, best practices on women's inclusive recovery, which is contemporary on the impact of pandemic with disaster and crisis. I call upon all for enhancing our cooperation to share knowledge, information, and global best practice on recovery, inclusion, and resilience. With this note, I would like to conclude here. Thank you all.
Many thanks, Dr. Rahman, for these excellent remarks and for sharing with us the important and remarkable achievements made in Bangladesh, as well as some of the lessons your government has learned throughout this process. Bangladesh provides indeed an outstanding model for gender-responsive and inclusive disaster risk management and disaster risk reduction, which we can all learn from. Many thanks for these excellent remarks. I would like to now welcome our virtual speaker, Ms. Nisreen El Saim, the chair of the UN Secretary General's Youth Advisory Group on Climate Change and chair of the Sudan Youth Organization on Climate Change. Ms. El Saim, I cannot see you, but I would like to virtually look at you and talk to you. You are an environmental and climate activist who began her activism in 2012. In 2019, you were named as one of the 30 UN Youth Special Envoys. In 2020, you were then appointed chair of the UN Secretary General's Youth Advisory Group on Climate Change, Climate and Security. That same year, the Africa Youth Awards named you one of the top 100 most influential young people in the world. Ms. El Saim, building on your rich experience of working with women in Sudan, could you please share with us the value of participation of women of different backgrounds in efforts to rebuild equal, sustainable, and peaceful societies? Ms. El Saim, we thank you for being part of this panel, and you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I hope you hear me well. I am very much also glad to be here with you all today, and thank you for inviting me. I wish I could be there with you physically, but I think online is good enough. Well, actually, women of Sudan are in my country, in my region also. Women are the pillars of everything, the pillars of the family. They have the household, the burden. They bring water, they give birth to babies. So basically, we are women-led community. But when it comes to a very important structure, which is the governance structure, we find that it's mostly men who do the governance problems. Well, this disoriented, let me say, share of power makes the women in our communities are very vulnerable, but at the same time very much proactive in not only solving problems but forbidding problems from happening in the first place. We keep saying that prevention is better than cure. Well, I have seen it in many places, and as a climate activist and a climate advocate, I know that working in climate action and building the resilience of the communities is not only peace building process, it's not only disaster risk reduction process, it's actually preventing the conflict from happening in the first place and preventing the disaster also from happening in the first place. We have a lot to contribute to, not only as women in our communities, but also as young generations. But do we have enough windows? Do we have enough space in the table? Do we get listened to? Do we get financed to do our ideas and implement the projects that we think fits our communities and fits the world? This is the question that we should all collaborate to answer for. Well, the title of the session today is very broad, very ambitious, but we reached a point where we all understand the problem. We all acknowledge that there is a climate change, that there is a pandemic happened, that the world is going through one of the toughest times through the humanity history. But the question is, are we able to solve it? I believe we are. How are we going to solve it? Who's going to solve it? And in which mechanism? Is the questions that we all have to find answers for and work collectively to empower young people, women, girls in their communities first of all, before talking about the international participation. If any one of you googled schools in Sudan and saw the pictures of that, they will understand why it's only, for example, me who is talking here from Sudan. They will understand why there is a huge problem currently in the power structure in the country. If you tried also to Google something very important, which is the percentage of young people who are out of school currently in my country or any other country, then you will find that the number is more than 5 million, according to the UNICEF, which is a huge number, which means that we will have a total illiterate generation. If you tried to search for basic needs and basic services access like health access or sexual and reproductive health, like peace and security, you will also find that we are decreasing. We are actually going to a certain stage where we are back into the 80s when it comes to the freedoms of speech and freedoms of gathering and freedom of media. So we are rapidly losing our very important privilege that we got. And I will stop here today because there is a lot to be said, but it's actually time for action.
Thank you. Thank you very much, dear Ms. El Saim, for this call for action and for also having highlighted that we are not necessarily advancing, but that we have to protect the rights we have acquired and really support the freedom of speech. You also mentioned the importance of creating voice and space for the voices of young women. And we thank you also in this context that you're here to advocate for that today. With this, I would like to give the floor, change to our next speaker, Ms. Sharon Buckman Rolls. And I would also like to invite an additional panelist, please, dear Noor, from Indonesia, from this home country, come join us. Yes. Thank you so much. Sorry for that. I didn't see that didn't have enough chairs. Thank you so much. Sorry, we had a logistical problem at the beginning here, thinking that we had two virtual speakers, and that's what created the lack of space. But we need her here. Thank you so much. So with this, I'm now delighted to introduce I'm delighted to introduce Ms. Sharon Buckman, Regional Manager of the Shifting the Power Coalition and a member of the Global Fund for Women Board, the Gender Liaison and Pacific Regional Representative for the Global Partnership for the Prevention of Armed Conflict, and a board member of the Women's Resilience to Disasters Program, which is UN Women's Disaster Risk Reduction Global Program. Ms. Sharon Buckman Rolls is a second-generation Fiji Island feminist who works to progress feminist practice and women's rights. With a professional background in broadcast media and as the regional manager of the Shifting the Power Coalition, she supports diverse Pacific Island women leaders and young women to enhance their collective power and influence and leadership to redesign systems and responses to disasters and climate change. The coalition reaches 100,000 women through its partner networks, including the Pacific Disability Forum and 13 women-led civil society organizations from across 7 Pacific Island Forum countries. Ms. Buckman Rolls, what entry points have you seen for strengthening the participation of women in all their diversity in intersecting crises, and how can we mobilize women's unique resources and capacities during reconstruction and recovery?
Honourable Minister, thank you, Rahel, for the question. Colleagues, I'll start by going back to March 2020, as Tropical Cyclone Harold barreled through 4 Pacific Island countries. Our islands also went into COVID lockdowns. We were dealing with intersecting crises across 6 Pacific Island countries and supporting through the Shifting the Power Coalition response to their needs of their local communities. In January this year, in the midst of a COVID lockdown as well, where we are based in Fiji, the Tongahanga Crisis took place, and it required us to organize to support our partners in Tonga, who not only were dealing with the immediate after effects of the volcanic eruption and tsunami, but also went into a COVID lockdown. So clearly, intersecting crises, whether they're environmental, climate change-induced, or health pandemics, is a reality. A landscape survey in November last year that we conducted through the Shifting the Power Coalition on the state of feminist organizing by civil society organizations and activists in response to the impact of climate change on the lives of women, girls, and LGBTQI plus individuals in the Pacific highlighted that the protracted nature of patriarchal systems, the lack of enabling environment and infrastructure for feminist organizing, were compounding, together with the compounding infrequent crises and risks, further exacerbate gender inequalities and exclusion. That's the baseline in terms of where are we, where have we come from? And as I listen to the young woman activist, I also think about the fact that in 1995, when all our member states adopted the Beijing Platform for Action, we still are having to realize those transformative changes, not only in my generation, but also in the generation of my daughter and my colleagues as well. So I'll make about 4 points. The first one is, really to talk about the fact that even by bearing the brunt of the climate crisis or COVID-19, we are not seeing women in the context of vulnerability only. I mean, that is the language that is used over and over again, and I think we really have to change the language, because women are weaving traditional indigenous knowledge to enhance safety and protection, to bring a human security, an inclusive human security approach to the work in the Pacific. I think the other channel for us to be able to really get better at ensuring that we're being transformative is to enable women's ability to exercise more power and control. And so a movement-led approach is vital. It's one of the reasons why we have women-led coalitions and networks such as ours that support women to be in that process of full, equal, and effective, meaningful participation that they own, that they design, and to ensure that their representation and leadership in diverse situations, conditions, are actually happening. This is necessary, as we heard during the latest Commission on the Status of Women, to ensure that relevant climate change, environmental, and disaster risk reduction decision-making bodies and processes are also being accountable to these commitments. So a movement-led approach is one that actually isn't just putting a Band-Aid on a problem, but actually addressing the deep structural and root causes of gender inequalities. I mean, that's critical, particularly if we're talking about providing that enabling environment for self-organization. You made a point, Rahel, for example, of the post-disaster needs assessment work. And I think that is clearly something where we need to make sure that the women are there as part of those assessments. It was something I had to learn in 2016 as we responded to TC Winston in Fiji. But interestingly enough, one of our reports around women-led responses to TC Harold and COVID-19 actually had women from across the 6 Pacific Island countries calling on gender audits for responses to be able to actually enhance that accountability. It's important to invest in women-led innovation. I think, this is something where access to information from the early warning to the response, recovery, and the redevelopment or the transformative phase is really important. So we are seeing in the Pacific that technology has been an accelerator of change, but it has to be appropriate and accessible. It has to be women-led and not necessarily top-down. And so we're quite excited that one of the programs that we are launching is called Pacific-owned women-led early warning and resilience systems. So it's power. It's about giving women the power through the technology to be able to get better in terms of preparedness as well as response. My 4th point is probably more targeted at intergovernmental processes. Many years ago, I started talking about a peace development humanitarian nexus approach because that is the reality of women's lives. A colleague I met at a UN agency in New York recently said that he finally agreed with me. He did. I think what's important is that we're ensuring coherence across the multitude of intergovernmental commitments, whether it's the Pacific Framework for Resilient Development or the Women, Peace and Security and Humanitarian Action Compact, the SDGs, or when we're driving an inclusive DRR governance approach. And this, in fact, is in line with UNSCR or UN Security Council Resolution 2242 on women, peace and security, which actually emerged from the global study on 1325 and actually refers to climate change and health pandemics based on women's work. So I think my final point really is that we certainly need to ensure that those conditions for decision-making, the conditions for participation at national level, whether it's in parliaments or in natural resource governance, in pandemic and climate processes, have the dedicated space for representatives of women's networks and feminist movements. We need equitable multi-stakeholder models which contribute to the adoption of well-funded national gender action plans. We need greater accountability to international treaties such as CEDAW and CRDP. And I think at the end of the day, I mean, if we're talking about what are the channels, it's those channels of accountability that can be women-owned, can be women-led, and are actually delivering on what young women of the world require right now. Thank you, Rahel.
Thank you so much, Ms. Buckman-Rolls, for having shared these excellent and inspiring experiences and lessons from the Pacific, and for having traveled all the way here to share these with us. Our next speaker is Ms. Nur Aisa Maulida from Indonesia, from this beautiful country here. Ms. Maulida, you are an ambassador for peace in Lamongan, Indonesia, an international relations student, and part of the Young Women Leaders for Peace movement. Your work focuses on mobilizing women and adolescent girls who live in conflict areas to be leaders and agents of peace. Your work draws attention to the specific challenges and double marginalization faced by young women. You have joined youth-based communities whose work cuts across varying issues, and you have been part of the establishment of DYPLO, an organization that focuses on youth empowerment and education. In 2020, you enrolled in the branch program of Amnesty International and the United Nations Association in Indonesia. Ms. Maulida, drawing upon your impressive and wide-ranging experience, please, could you kindly tell us about the experiences of young women in these situations? What are the specific challenges young women face in post-disaster contexts and crisis? And what are the best ways of supporting the meaningful participation of these young women? Ms. Maulida, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you so much. Good evening, everybody. Selamat sore. Esteemed guests, friends, and colleagues, I am Ais from Girl Ambassador for Peace Indonesia. We are an organization of young women and girls working for peace, women's rights, and gender equality. And we were established in 2017 with support from a global network, Women Peace Builder, and the Asian Muslim Action Network Indonesia. So, as we know that the pandemic brings serious impacts on women, and it's throwing away achievements from decades of countless battles to achieve gender equality. Problems related to healthcare, education, and security issues getting so much worse during pandemic, especially for us young women. So today, we may have reached our best point when the situation is getting much more better day by day. But I want to remind you that the war is not over until it's over. So from monthly meetings that hosted by my organization, Girl Ambassador for Peace Indonesia, that gather young women from many provinces in Indonesia, we found that young women are facing mental health issues caused by inability to adapt to the pandemic, and negativity such as toxic productivity and hostile culture surrounded them, and it remains uncontrolled until today. On the positive side, the situation triggered the growth of self-awareness that maintaining mental health is as important as maintaining psychical health. But from stories of girls that we've met, most of them are still don't know where they can access help if they are facing mental health problems, and what to do to prevent mental health problems. Also, some of young women and girls do not feel that their home are safe enough for them to spend most of their time during pandemic and self-quarantine. Sexual violence is a serious threat that in a domestic sphere. In the year of 2021 alone, in Indonesia, we had the highest increase of sexual gender-based violence cases. They increased 50% higher than the previous year. And most of these cases were domestic sexual violence and cyber gender-based violence that targeted young women as social media user and internet user. Also, Indonesian Commission for Women captured that the number of early, forced, and child marriages increased like 3 times higher than the previous years before the pandemic. And from this data, it means that there is always someone that is traumatized and need help. That's why the adoption of very long-awaited crime of sexual violence law in 2022, and the ministerial decree against sexual violence in universities is a big win for us Indonesian women. And speaking in my context as a part of community that has concern on protecting women and girls' rights, Girl Ambassador for Peace Indonesia trying our best to provide as much as support as we can, and we have tagline Girls Support Girls, and most of our programs are focused on building young women's capacity, like some of those programs are Peace Goes to School, Girls Camp, and Girls Talk, so they can actively participate in social media campaigns on preventing mental health problems, sexual violence, as well as preventing and countering violent extremism, like you have heard about Lamongan before, and build and sustain peace. We also promote resilience in local communities and societies, which starts by building strong peer-to-peer support groups. And talking about the best way to supporting our participation, especially in peace building and promoting women's rights and gender equality, is to recognize us as leaders, peace builders, and change makers. We play an important role in our communities. We build intergenerational connection that help all of us to be aware and sensitive to each other's needs. That's why our tagline is Girls Support Girls. So you may help us by giving us recognition, establishing good synergies among communities, providing funding for our activities, and creating opportunities so we can further and strengthen our capacities. Also, not forget to mention, since most of our activity were moved into online platform during pandemic and right until today, we are still adapting with transition to normal condition by trying to hold hybrid event. Cyber security threat is another problem that we face, and it shouldn't be underestimated. So it will be necessary too for us to provide proper help mechanism as well as enrich young women's knowledge about cybersecurity threat prevention, since, as I have mentioned earlier, that young women are also the main target of cyber gender-based violence. And reflecting on our journey since 2017, I conclude that every single support from you matters a lot from us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Maulida, for these excellent insights, and also for having highlighted the importance of access for mental health services to women and young women, and to which extent this is absolutely critical for a lasting recovery. We have now a last intervention, and we are running late. So we have one last intervention from Nina Birkeland from the Norwegian Refugee Council. Ms. Birkeland, thank you for being there, and you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and Honourable Minister, Madam Chair, and co-panelists. I think it's fantastic that we have this chance to be part of this panel. I will be brief. I hear you loud and clear on that. But my organization, the Norwegian Refugee Council, we work on disaster displacement as one of the issues that affect displaced people. And for me to have this chance to be on the panel together with Noor and Nisrin, Honourable Minister, and also Sharon from Fiji, I think it really shows what's going on around disaster displacement. Bangladesh has been the chair of the platform on disaster displacement for several years. Fiji is the current chair. So we see these are countries and states that wants to step up. But we as civil society, as youth, old people, we also need to do our job. So in my little presentation today, I want to focus on women's housing, land and property rights in situations of disaster displacement. And as we know, when the global temperatures increase with climate change, so has the intensity and frequency of related disasters, leading to increased risk of disaster displacement. We see that more and more people are forced to flee their homes because of floods, tropical storms, droughts, sea level rise, amongst many other natural hazards, that everything leads to disaster displacement. When disaster displacement hits, significant housing, land and property rights and protection challenges arise. And that's why we as NRC really want to focus on women's HLP rights, housing, land and property rights. Many women around the world are disadvantaged because land ownership remains restricted. Men, both by tradition and law. Women are less likely than men to possess documentary evidence of their land tenure and more likely to experience violence in relation to dispute when they return from displacement. During the recovery and reconstruction phases, women may need specific support to exercise their housing, land and property rights and rebuild their lives. Women's HLP rights are about having a home, having a place that offers shelter, safety and ability to secure a livelihood. A home free from fear of forced eviction. Even before disasters hit, displaced women are often disadvantaged when it comes to assessing their HLP, the housing, land and property rights. Housing, land and property rights includes the full spectrum of rights. It's housing, land and property, and it's according to both customary and statutory law, informally and formally. It's held by owners, tenants, corporate dwellers, customary land tenure owners and users, and informal sector dwellers without secure tenure. These rights are intrinsically related to environmental rights, which imply access to the unspoiled natural resources that enable survival, including land, shelter, food, and water. If the issue of women's HLP rights is misunderstood or ignored in recovery and reconstruction, serious protection concerns emerge that can lead to conflict, violence, dispossession, and further displacement. However, if addressed in a clear, thoughtful, and systematic way, these rights can be upheld and communities can enhance their capacity to bounce back and find solutions. And this is for displaced women, men, boys, and girls. In conclusion, disaster recovery planning presents a critical opportunity to empower displaced people to find sustainable solutions to their displacement. How? We've heard a lot. By engaging displaced women, men, boys, and girls, rather than just consulting. Displaced women can put their significant enthusiasm to co-design and carry out recovery plans that address their needs not only for housing, land and property rights, but also services that can contribute to the whole community's resilience. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Birkeland. Thanks for having joined us on this panel. We are running out of time, but we will be able to make space for 2 questions from the floor. If any of you have a question? Yes, please. If you could please introduce yourself, your name, your title, and then share your question.
I'll be very quick. My name is Zinat. I'm from Bangladesh, and I'm working with a friendship NGO. So my point is that women accessibility for more power control is an issue we have been talking for a long time. But what I have discovered when I was working with the community that not only the men or culture or the religion, but this is the women, sometimes they're putting barrier themselves to come out from their cave actually. So and another thing that whenever there is a new disaster happening, like cyclone, flood, or COVID-19, we are discovering a new angle of women vulnerability. And why is that? Because we are working with this issue for a long time. Then what is actually the problem? Actually we are able to identify the reason for our vulnerabilities. And another point I like to mention that our contribution at the national level is important, but we should more focus on the local level, because here is the power control. We need to actually have our accessibility, because without the local level or local understanding, it's not possible to the national level our voice will go. And my request to the panelists actually is to know about what is the reason, when is a new disaster and new angle of vulnerability arise for us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If there's no other question, I'm wondering whether one of our panelists would like to reflect on this comment made by our dear colleague. Sharon, please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. I think one of the things that you are what you're highlighting is one of the points I made, that we need to really not just do the Band-Aid. We don't just need to be saying these are programs for women, but we actually need to be looking at the root causes of inequalities if we want a gender transformative result. So whether it's working with faith or traditional leaders, and as you said, really getting to the root causes, starting at the local level. So participation, the prevention of inequalities, the protection, etc. I think the other thing also is that we also need to be looking within the system, within our different societies, what are the different coping mechanisms, and the fact that gender-based violence is such a high indicator, such a prevalent indicator in all the different crises that we have, and exacerbated by COVID, that we actually really seriously need to look at those drivers, the social, the economic, and the political drivers of all forms of violence. So I hope that helps. Thank you.
Thank you so much, dear Sharon, and Honorable Minister, Dr. Inem. You also wanted to share your reflections on this point. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. The women who asked the question is from Bangladesh, and me also from Bangladesh. I think there is some misunderstanding with the government policy and the actual scenario in Bangladesh. Our Honorable Prime Minister is very much careful about women empowerment, and for his tremendous effort to empower the women, he got the United Nations Award, Planet 50-50 Award, and change initiatives. In Bangladesh, if you look, the Prime Minister is women, the Parliament leader is women, opposition leader is women, Honorable Speaker of the Parliament is women, so many Vice Chancellor of public and private universities is women, there is so many justices are women, women are working with bright career in Army, Navy, Air Force, Police also. And in Parliament there is women member of Parliament, and there is 50 reserve seat for the women to participate in as a Parliament member. And in the field level, if you see in Upazila, there is, or what is called sub-district, there is two vice chairmen. One must be women. And in the field level in Union Council, there is 3 reserve seats for the women. And in primary education, Ministry of Primary Education, the more than 80% teachers of the primary schools must be women in Bangladesh. And in women and child ministry, Minister of Women and Child Affairs, the staffs, the workers, the officers should be 60%. And there is so many regulatory framework to preserve the right of the women is established in Bangladesh. So I think today, what is the situation? There is no barrier for the women in Bangladesh to come forward and to participate in all sectors of Bangladesh. So I think my the question is he understand what is the real situation of Bangladesh, and we hope that by the leadership of our Honorable Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina, we will go forward with our men and women and girls both. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Honorable Minister. We've come to the end of our session. Distinguished participants and panelists, Honorable Minister, today we have reflected on progress, but also impressive results and achievements for building and enabling governance environment and strengthening action on gender-responsive and inclusive recovery in order to address the needs of women, girls, people with disabilities, and other high-risk and marginalized groups. We further identified some key barriers, opportunities, and enabling factors for addressing their priorities and needs. These include securing empowerment, leadership, and the meaningful participation of excluded groups in recovery decision-making processes, ensuring that recovery coordination mechanisms are inclusive, and recognizing the important role of youth and the major contributions of civil society organizations, including grassroots organizations, to integrate the priorities and needs of the disproportionately impacted and enable their meaningful participation. Let me close by warmly thanking our excellent and distinguished speakers for your fantastic contributions. On behalf of UN Women, we would also like to express a warm thanks to our sister agencies UNDP and the World Bank for the opportunity to highlight the recovery needs and agency of women and girls, people with disabilities, and other marginalized groups at this critical conference, and for having dedicated an entire session to this topic. We will conclude this session by playing a short video sharing women's perspectives on the importance of women leadership in risk-informed recovery and resilience. Thank you very much. And have a good evening, and a good day and a good evening on those online. Thank you for your participation.
Women should not only be seen as beneficiaries of services and support, but identified as key actors in shaping and building climate resilience.
All the women are talented women, smart, knowing the safety of the family during the disaster and the climate change.
Although women are forced to bear the brunt of the consequences of climate change, they have been systematically excluded from decision-making.
I would like to highlight the need for paradigm shift from seeing women as victims of disasters to see them as active agents of change, as leaders in their community, in their environments.
Cross-cutting all thematic area where DRR is involved, ensuring that there's always a gender lens to any policies, to any projects, to any initiatives, so that it gives an enable environment for women to participate.
I believe that we can achieve a safe environment for young girls and women to prosper and to have the necessary positions in leadership.
Women's leadership and involvement in the decision-making process provides for more inclusivity and specialized support services to these vulnerable persons in our communities.
The cyclones are getting stronger, and women has a big role to play in the rebuilding homes and the community.
I'm working with young women climate champions in order to empower and enhance their understanding on climate justice and play a leadership role.
Working with women leaders at all levels, from community to regional level, international level, I have seen how having diverse leadership in DRR can reduce vulnerability to disasters and climate change. They are critical actors in effectively managing risks and in designing and implementing programs that build the resilience of all of their communities.
My message to women is, take the risk, come out of your comfort zone and lead in this different field that we're in. And I always say, even though I'm the first woman to hold the position of director and DMO, I should not be the last.
I believe that we can achieve all the goals that we have for gender equality.